Hello everyone and welcome back to Under the Plate, our Final Fantasy VII exclusive series here at Final Weapon, and today we're back with episode 38, focusing in on some recent interviews from Final Fantasy Remake series director Naoki Hamaguchi. In case you haven't noticed, Director Hamaguchi has been quite busy talking with all sorts of outlets and creators on a massive press tour ahead of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade's release later this January on Nintendo Switch 2 and Xbox. That's a mouthful. So, we've got a lot to talk about today, but Payne, how's it been? How have you been going so far?
Oh, just working on some projects you guys will see very soon. Very soon.
Excited. Very excited for those. They should be coming out within a matter of a day with this video. So, look forward to that. But with this episode of Under the Plate, we really took a couple of Director Hamaguchi's interviews and we want to focus on this idea of perception in the remake project. And you might remember we actually did make a video on this, which we'll touch on in a bit, but it's been definitely noticeable seeing the language used in these interviews and looking back at that video and some of the interviews we pulled from like 10 years ago. So, to really dive into these interviews, we're going to talk about 4 specific ones today, but the first one is with Eurogamer, which occurred just a few weeks back, and Hamaguchi spoke with the team basically saying that because of the decision to work with the original team and the love for Final Fantasy VII, he's not trying to overwrite the original game with what is essentially a fan fiction, but create a new version of the game that is clear and direct and follows the original game. And again, I feel like that's an interesting call out from Hamaguchi-san, specifically because he mentions fan fiction, and I think, people might take that out of context as they will, but in his mind, I feel like that just means his version of the game. Right? Like his version of the events and, his version of stuff that he would like to see a certain way.
Yeah, and that's what quite a few of these interviews will end up touching upon, as you all end up seeing here soon. But really, also just I feel like that fanfiction word's thrown around a lot, especially in the Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy communities. Just people like lobbing criticisms at the writing, which is kind of absurd for many reasons. But especially with something like Final Fantasy VII, there's a really old Nomura interview about Remake from a few years back that you might have brought it up in that video, I'm not quite sure. But, Nomura a while back talked about everyone has a preconceived idea of what FF7 is to them.
Yep.
And that's something Hamaguchi is probably very aware of, because everyone on the staff, especially some of the younger staff, probably do have this very special memory of Final Fantasy VII, which is what the game means to them. And just looking at the game's themes and some of the inspirations from things like Yogacara and the Young psychology, you can see that this really seeps through the whole project. So seeing Hamaguchi kind of carry this theme in his heart on how he wants to, lead this project is honestly comforting. And really the fact that he has some of these, just pillars of Final Fantasy that made this original game alongside him, I think he probably kind of views them almost as the shipwrights, they make sure everything is going to be on course.
Oh, for sure. And I think overall, Hamaguchi is clearly someone who embodies and understands everything about Final Fantasy VII. I've met him personally, spoken with him personally. He is someone who is very, very passionate about the brand as a whole. He's worked on numerous games for Square Enix over the last, 15 plus years. And I think it's really great to see him, finally take the role that he has as director. And you're absolutely right with his ability to leverage the different original creative minds behind the game, being Kazushige Nojima, Tetsuya Nomura, and Yoshinori Kitase. I mean, those are the 3 great minds, some would say, behind that original game. And so they're right there with him, working alongside him on this project. And even if, let's say, Hamaguchi wanted to do a fan fiction, I don't think that would have happened. I don't, you know what I mean? But I totally agree with you. It's very, very comforting in the idea that he understands what the goal of the remake project is. And it sounds like, you know, as we'll get to further in of this video, that this was always the plan.
Yeah, and we'll touch on like specifically like the planning of it. But even ignoring that, I think especially us kind of delving in on this idea of perception with these interviews, this is interesting because we're getting actual, like, a new point of view from the developers, like an updated one, because we don't always get to hear too much about what they think about the games. A lot of it's a little more on the promo side, like, you know, when the game got Steam Deck certified and everything. We'd get some tidbits about development and story and like character things, but actually being able to hear more about how they hold themselves when making this project and deciding how it's going to actually be presented to us, it's a nice way to actually get a look into their minds, and that really lets us decide for ourselves how we each individually feel about how they're tackling the project. And I mean, Noah and I truly do see like the vision that they have, and it really lines up with what we've been seeing in the games, is how I feel.
100%. And I definitely think, you know, there's obviously nothing is ever unanimously beloved by everyone, but I do think, at least in the case of the remake project, you know, and it's fair, you know, it's fair for people to question whether or not they can stick the landing. I have the utmost confidence that when Part 3 comes out, many players who were kind of unsure of what was going on or felt that the story was changing will start to understand and see that vision realized of everything that this has been building toward. And, you know, let's keep moving on, because I think this next comment really ties in with that. So Hamaguchi was asked, and I think this is like probably the 10th time that this question has been asked in some shape or form. He was asked basically, you know, how did the project take shape? And Hamaguchi basically said, in terms of the overall plot, how the story was going to go, and the overall themes and the direction, that was all very down at the beginning when we started. So, you know, he goes on to basically talk about, hey, we weren't 100% done with figuring out the rough details, figuring out where the games were exactly going to end beyond the first game and stuff like that, but we knew where thematically and narratively this story was going from day one. And I think, again, when we're talking about the stuff that we are with perception and just how people are perceiving this project as a new thing, you know, this comment right here makes it pretty obvious to me that this isn't something that changed or was something decided mid-development. You know, people have said, oh, after Remake, they changed their minds and changed the ideas of what they were going for and reeled it back in Rebirth. And I really don't think that's the case at all. I think that people just perceive things a certain way. And, you know, as we continue to talk about, perception can truthfully change so much for an individual to where something almost becomes reality.
Yeah, and honestly, like, we can see, especially after Rebirth, when you get down to brass tacks and compare some of the structure and ideas found in Remake and Rebirth, you really see that they're not all that different. And we'll talk about another interview that mentions some more specifics about this, but it's been pretty much set in stone from the beginning that this is going to be a tried and true remake, just with things that mix some things up. And a lot of that comes from just adding in everything else from the compilation. This is supposed to be like a cohesive whole. Because back around the original 10th anniversary of Final Fantasy VII, you know, they were leading up to it with Advent Children, Crisis Core, we got books, we got that anime OVA before Crisis Core and everything. So there was a lot that was added to the universe, and it might even be that same Nomura interview I brought up on the last Hamaguchi one, but that's really the thing we're getting at here, is that I feel personally that a lot of fan perception has changed while developer intent hasn't veered off course whatsoever. Because even in
Mm-hmm.
an old Nomura interview, he talks about almost like the parallax or just the difference between all those thoughts, like I said prior, but also just how parts of the compilation as they got added put a little static in the fray as well, because while they expanded the universe, they didn't all like perfectly line up, and Nomura kind of brought that down to, there being different directors and creators involved in like the production and getting all of these out. So this is almost reevaluating everything that we saw in like the 2000s from the compilation and piecing it all together in what we know from the original FF7, while paying as much respect as possible and honestly even changing up the tone slightly of different things to fit original FF7 better.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that Namor interview you keep referencing, I'm just going to dive into it now because, yes, that was a very key part of that video back in February. And I feel like that this is just an interview that so many people have overlooked. I mean, it's crazy. So it was with Young Jump, and it was actually about, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And Nomura said, this is more to do with the overall goal of the remake trilogy and not just Rebirth, but one desire has been to correct and unify distortions in people's perceptions. The usual formula with a remake is to keep gameplay systems and story as is while enhancing graphics. However, more than 20 years have passed since the original game came out, and merely improving the visuals wouldn't create something that meets modern standards. So he continues, right? And there's just more and more stuff, but I'll read a couple quotes that he says that really stand out. I also think players' memories of the game have been heavily skewed by nostalgia. I don't think there are many players who have been constantly replaying Final Fantasy VII for the past 2 decades, so each player's memories have slowly and steadily diverged over time. And then he continues, furthermore, with Final Fantasy VII having multiple spin-off titles, certain scenes have become different from what they were in the original. Because of all the time that's passed in the existence of these spin-offs, there's been this subtle distortion of perception in players' memories. When someone replays the game, they might think, wait, this is how that scene goes? But I remember it differently. I'm conscious of this too, but particularly Nojima, who's in charge of the scenario, was concerned about this distortion of perception, so we really want to bring everything together into one. I mean, in my opinion, I don't need to read anything else. I feel like that tells you everything you need to know about the remake trilogy. And I understand people still have their doubts, but considering everything that we've gotten so far, and considering everything that we have been told from the beginning, it makes complete sense to say that yes, the goal is to unify this perception, and this idea of perception has been a focus for the development team.
And it's honestly really interesting. And picking up that thread I said earlier, like when you really look at how they handled both Remake and Rebirth, it makes a lot of sense. While there's a lot of differences between Remake and Rebirth, when you really get under the hood, I think a lot of that just has to do with like how different those two parts of the original game ultimately are.
Yeah.
Because Noah and I have brought it up several times before in the past. Rebirth is this middle part of FF7 where really their main goal is just to find Sephiroth. And that's not really when a bunch of things start coming to a head. That's when we start getting like the character moments that flesh out like Barrett, that flesh out Red. And just like Remake, Rebirth added in characters like Kyrie. Remake had Leslie. And what's interesting about how they integrate things from the compilation is that I feel like they integrate them in a way that doesn't compromise experiencing that part of the compilation. Because while, for example, in Rebirth, we get some of that stuff with Zack to tie him into the themes of the trilogy and add in those extra layers they've been adding with the world and live stream stuff, that doesn't replace Crisis Core. Or, the Turks novel, The Kids Will Be Alright, isn't replaced by Leslie also showing up in Remake. Those characters now have like a firm grounding within the game's universe that they didn't have before. And then we get extra characters that flesh out some other aspects of the world. Because I don't quite remember if Broden is also from a novel. I don't think he is, but that kind of gives us a bit more to like the soldier degradation storylines and see how it even affects people that got out of that life.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm pretty sure that he was first introduced in Rebirth, but I could be wrong on that. I agree with you. I don't think he's a novel character. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I just think that when we think about this and we talk about Rebirth as a game being the middle part, if you look at the original game and what Rebirth covered, that was going to be the worst part of the trilogy, being completely honest. And that's not a bad thing, but like you said, the whole goal was go find Sephiroth. You're chasing Sephiroth. In the original game, if you sliced that section as its own game, it would be kind of monotonous and boring in a way. And the development team did so many wonderful things to keep that engaging from beginning to end. And yes, you're continuing to fight Sephiroth, but it felt like you were connecting with the planet and really this grander journey was there. It wasn't just going from point A to point B the whole time. Even if you were, it didn't feel like that when you were playing.
And that's a small thing I'll touch on next is we brought up the Hamaguchi interviews first because those are the most recent and really diving into the current state of things. But what was interesting about just this slightly older Nomura one is just how they perfectly line up. And the more you look at both of these games side by side, you see the developer intent is quite clear, I feel. And that also comes down to other perceptive things, because what we're getting out of these interviews is, you know, the director's perception of how, like, we're viewing things and how the fans see things. Like, there's also that, like, very minor question about the whisper interpretation being, like, fan expectations and developer, like, wishes and stuff. And what Hamaguchi's like, oh, that's an interesting way to look at it, but it's not really something they'd been considering actively in the development or anything. But that's what it comes down to, is this developer perception is something we're finally getting a bit more of a taste of more consistently. And I feel that's kind of important reassurance as we're nearing the end of this.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think it's awesome that Square Enix basically let Hamaguchi do like what was probably 30 to 50 interviews in the last 2 months. I think that's awesome. I can't really tell you what other company is letting their, lead director do that many interviews. And it's such a unique situation too, because we've had 2 games of a trilogy come out and he's still bringing new information to light. And again, I just love that we get these perspectives from him. And there's actually a few more interviews worth talking about, just really bringing this conversation together on perception. Hamaguchi speaking with at the Brazil game show with IGN, he talked about the fact that they've taken the through line of the OG story, carefully combining it with all sorts of timeline storylines, and created something that can keep players excited and wondering how everything is going to turn out, saying that that's the basic concept, and he can tell you that approach is something that's not going to change in Part 3. The ending's already drawn out, but at this point, what they're aiming for is to deliver an ending both original fans and new players who entered with Remake can find compelling. And, he's talked about this again and again and again, that one of the key things is delivering an ending that satisfies everyone. And I think that kind of leaves people with cold feet, right? Oh, how do you make an ending that satisfies everyone? I mean, people online immediately said multiple endings. No, I don't think that's the answer. It's totally fun to theorize. We could be completely wrong, as we always can be, and as we always mention. But I do think that the idea and the concept of having multiple endings is a little silly, considering a game like this. I think personally, and we talk about it in that video, Under the Plate, episode 16, I really think what they're talking about when they say, a satisfying and compelling ending is being more clear. It's, in that video, I talk endlessly about the fact that the original Final Fantasy VII is ambiguous with its ending, and it was kind of a big deal at the time because really all the Final Fantasy games and most RPGs were pretty direct in their endings. They didn't really leave things, wondering what was going on. But Final Fantasy VII ended, obviously, if you're watching this, we're going to say it. Final Fantasy VII ended with, a glimpse of Aerith, the life stream coming up beneath the planet and pushing back the meteor. And we saw a clip from 500 years in the future with all of Midgar overrun by plants, and Red 13 was there with children, right? So you can take away a lot from that, but at the same time, what happened to the party? What happened to Cloud? What happened to Aerith? What happened to Tifa? What happened to everyone? There's no telling because it wasn't clear. And to me, obviously the team rectified that with Advent Children. Okay, so everyone survived because some people weren't sure if they survived. They thought, nature overtook the planet and humanity joined the live stream or something. But at the end of the day, I think that this new ending that they keep referring to, oh man, we want to make this super satisfying ending, this compelling ending that satisfies everyone. I think the goal behind that is to make something super clear and make it clear that the party survives. I think that's the most important.
Oh, please!
thing.
I hope the staff survives.
Yeah, the more a self-insert maybe, but I think the big thing here is they want to make it 100% clear that the party survives after the meteor, and I think that they're gonna take some time in the end of the game to really show what happens in the direct aftermath of that end of the game, right? And I think that that's important for players to feel like, this is the true ending of Final Fantasy VII. This is it. We're saying goodbye to these characters forever, but we get to see them, finally free of Sephiroth, and it's over, and the mission's complete. And, you don't get that feeling in the original game. And so I really do think that's what they're going for, tying everything in. But again, we could be completely wrong. When we talk about a ending that would satisfy new players and original game players, that's kind of what I feel, because it's not changing the original ending, but it's kind of modifying it to fit more in line with Advent Children.
And really, just looking at how they've been handling Remake and Rebirth, there's these new layers, but much like these interviews have just kind of restated, they're making all of this work within the compilation. This is the full story of FF7, and really making an ending that could make fans happy and, new players happy would be one that completely respects the original game and just presents it in like a new, fresh light. Just really dive into it, and they could present it almost the same, but with just like some extra scenes I feel that will lead into the future of Final Fantasy VII, which would be things like Advent Children or possibly some other stuff we might talk about some other point.
True. And, building on that and the idea of the compilation, there's one more interview that Hamaguchi had with Polygon in mid-October. I feel like that is worth mentioning. And he said the goal of the remake project is, quote, take the original storyline, add new things from spin-offs to other sources that already existed in the world of Final Fantasy VII, splitting it into 3 games, and by doing so, make fans wonder how the story will end. I mean, once again, I feel like it's so clear when you look at this and you're perceiving this game is, I wouldn't say like evilly, but it is purposefully made in a way to make you question what's going to happen. And it does so ingeniously, and I 100% believe, again, with part 3, everything's going to come together, but the intent and direction of the development team has always been clear. And I feel like in this lull period we've had since Rebirth and part 3, there's been so much commentary on, everyone having a different perception of what happened to Aerith. Everyone having a different perception of worlds and what they are. And I mean, we've seen this. We've talked about this stuff. And I just feel like it's been really interesting to see Hamaguchi-san come out and talk about it directly, basically saying, yeah, this is our goal, this is what we're doing. And it is just kind of funny to me that this is just totally overlooked.
And I guess that's really how it goes, and it's truly the sad thing about, because they've hit the nail on the head. People do have this very specific idea of pretty much any of their favorite Final Fantasies, but particularly 7. Because, 7 is the darling of the series. It is the one that most people have honestly played. It's the one that made the most impact. It's the one, when people think of Final Fantasy, beyond 14 has a lot of headspace these days, but people are usually going to think of Cloud and Sephiroth. And no matter what, they could probably never make a game that would make everyone happy. Some people swear that if it was turn-based, it'd be whatever, the best thing ever, and it would still be great, but that's not exactly how this series is trying to present itself, because it's more than just the original FF7. And that's honestly something fans have, made Final Fantasy VII. Fans have made Final Fantasy VII more than what it is. The demand for that universe led to things like the compilation. The demand for it led to this remake. And really just knowing that the developers are looking at this on every side and still trying to make something that is actually impossible to make is honestly very, very nice as a fan. And some of this perception stuff, it really is just a lot of circular stuff on the internet, I feel. And I think that's what has some of these questions brought up in interviews, because even if because honestly, you and I both finished Rebirth and we're we know where this is going, or at least we feel we know where it's going. We at least know the vibe of what these games are trying to do, and we do believe that we have a somewhat clear picture in our heads of what part 3 is going to be like. And it just seems like we keep revisiting this because the internet just keeps kind of regurgitating the same things, the fan fiction, all the theories. Because even look at the old FF8 theory of Squall is dead, and it being brought up to Hitase or somebody in an old interview, and he's no, that's not really what our intent was with the game. And wasn't there a recent interview where there was something along the lines of that with the whispers? Yeah, I brought that up earlier, and it's more of a live stream thing because of the expansion of this.
Right. Rebirth makes it pretty clear that the Cetra, tie into the whispers and stuff like that. And asking Hamaguchi, and it totally makes sense, right? It's a perception thing. It's okay, the developers specifically added this in here because these are the original fans trying to prevent change. And it's Hamaguchi's oh, I hadn't heard of that. That's funny. I can understand how someone might think that. But that's not the case. And, it just ties back at the end of the day. And people perceive things in different ways. With the end of Remake, people saw this concept of fate being changed as specifically the party. When in reality, I really think that Square was leaning on that as the planet, right? The fate of the planet. That's what the original game is all about. That's what everything's about. That's what all the marketing's about. You're trying to save the planet. And I think it just is, it is 100% a nature of the internet. And of course, I love seeing all the theories. I think it's so cool how people are able to come up with all this stuff and find all these references. And, I always see videos, I'm oh, I'd never thought of that. That's really interesting. But at the same time, we've talked about this. Again, we really have a lot. I just found these interviews a great time to revisit this topic. It's been however many months since November, or since February. It's now November. It's been 9 months since we talked about this. But I just feel that people needlessly overcomplicate Final Fantasy VII Remake. And it's completely okay to look at something and say, hey, you know, I think that this crazy thing is happening. I think there's this huge meta twist going on. It's mind-boggling how incredible the devs are. And, you know, I think it's awesome to think super in depth like that and try to tie together these crazy threads between the games. But at a certain point, it does just kind of feel like people are looking for stuff that just isn't there. And, you know, these interviews with Hamaguchi just kind of reinforce that, because this is the same thing that's been said since 2015, right? Like, we've known what the goal of the project has been since 2015, to tie together the compilation, to bring everything into one, to add some new bits here and there, to expand and really make this the ultimate experience of Final Fantasy VII in its entire compilation. And I just feel like that this gets lost in track, you know? You're 100% right that, like, it is, we really have talked about this multiple times, and it's just interesting to me that this keeps getting brought up in interviews with Hamaguchi. And again, I feel like it's that perception thing of just people not necessarily understanding or perceiving that from the games, and so it just keeps getting asked.
And there really seems to be some disconnect between the creatives of this project and, I'd say, at least a decent chunk of the fan base, and if not the fan base, a decent chunk of just at least somewhat uninitiated, out of the loop internet people. And I think that's what a lot of this is born from, truly. And I'm not quite sure what could be done outside of more interviews like this to kind of make fans understand this, or whoever is, you know, spurring questions like this to be asked in an interview setting in the first place.
100%. And I think about, you know, there's so many things I'm sure Hamaguchi would love to talk about. Once part 3 gets revealed, that'll slowly start to get opened up, and especially after the game's out, I cannot wait to see what they have to say then. But, you know, I feel like we're in an interesting time period where there's a lot that we don't know, and that's okay. But for the stuff that we do know, I feel like that there are more interesting topics that we can talk about. And, you know, with this perception, it's everything boils down to perception. As Nomura said, everyone has their own version of Final Fantasy VII. So it's definitely going to be interesting when part 3 comes out, and, you know, that is it. That is the game. And to kind of see how people interpret it. You know, I'm curious if people are going to perceive things differently in that game too. I really do think the development team has done a great job at putting together everything in a digestible way that allows for, you know, people who just want to experience the story to go through it and have an idea of what's going on. But for those that really want to engage with the world, you have like hundreds of hours of content to go through. So I'm really curious to see, you know, how do we tie in more stuff from Deep Ground and Dirge of Cerberus? How are we going to tie in Advent Children? How are we going to tie in more stuff from Before Crisis? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that they still have to pull some strings with in part 3. And when it comes to that perception, I'm really interested to see, you know, what happens there.
And yeah, honestly, we're just getting to the point where this thing we need to see the ending to really see what this game has to say on all of this. Because, well, I do believe for the most part this is just a fairly straightforward, comprehensive remake of the entirety of FF7. What's interesting about it is that this is all of FF7, specifically through the lens of OG FF7, just because, you know, we kind of have Cloud as like an even stronger anchoring point and like perspective character for these games, just because of how much further we dive into his psyche, especially seen with Rebirth. And we're seeing all these things through Cloud that Cloud wasn't necessarily always involved in, like Cloud and the party, because we didn't see some of that deep ground stuff with them until like Dirge of Cerberus, while we got tastes of it through Crisis Core's ending. And I think that's probably just another weird thing, that being a series, like even original FF7, because we've talked about the, if Final Fantasy VII lies to you, because so many aspects of it aren't, narrators you can trust with your whole heart and mind. That is FF7 because of these psychological aspects. And Remake doing what it's doing with the worlds ties into that. And there is a small meta narrative going on, but I don't think, much like Hamaguchi was like, it's nothing like the whispers or like the fan expectations or anything like that. It's more so the meta commentary on perspective, which is really just drizzled throughout this whole project.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, and I totally agree. There is meta commentary here. I feel like people who say that this is a one-to-one remake are wrong. People who say that this is a completely, it's a sequel are wrong. It is something of a revisited Final Fantasy VII with all the compilation intact, with the meta commentary and narrative thrown on top of that, right? Because that does exist here. I don't feel like it would be ignorant to not say that. And so you hit the nail on the head. I completely agree. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting as we continue to head towards part 3 to see how people react to this stuff. But I'm personally super excited for it. And seriously, I just cannot wait to see what's next. And yeah, I mean, again, there will always be people perceiving things in different ways. And that has honestly been the fun of the hype cycle for these games, I think. Seeing people perceive the ending as some crazy multiversal thing where there's like a live Aerith, a dead Aerith, this Aerith, that Aerith. Like, that was fun to watch. And, we're getting to the point where, all right, guys, like, we're about to start part 3 hype, right? Like, it would not be surprising if we get a reveal in the next coming months. So I'm really excited to see what the future holds, but I do think that the fanbase as a whole has to keep this idea of perception in mind, because it's something that the developers have clearly placed intent on, both in the story, in the game, and in the marketing of the game overall.
And you can really, like, when you pay attention, just truly see how it seeped through, because Noah even was saying things like, the changing fate, which that just ties back to the planet and like the whole point of the original game. So it's these things that are there, and they've, in these interviews, even this new batch, because that's what this new batch of Hamaguchi interviews really has been for me. Like, we've been getting some like fun little tidbits that have just been interesting to hear, but we've also just been getting a lot reinforced. And I feel like a lot of people need to either open up their minds to what this project is or just accept what it is.
100%. Yeah, it's definitely great to hear that Ben Starr wants to be a chocobo. But I'm also like,
what he needs to do is say the chocobo. I'm a chocobo.
I am all for more interviews with Hamaguchi. Yes, but at a certain point, it's also like, okay, I feel like we've talked about this topic so much to the point where we just have to talk about it, because it's like, gosh, guys, we've talked about perception before. It's just not something that people are taking in. But at the end of the day, if, this idea of perception, if the interviews that we talked about today were interesting to you, I highly, highly, highly recommend go and check out Under the Plate episode 16. We really spent a lot of time on that one, and we go through basically every interview leading up to Remake and Rebirth, talking about the games and what they are. And I felt that at least we put together a pretty compelling case as to why this story is not changing and why it's only evolving with the rest of the compilation included this time. But again, as we always say, we could be completely wrong. Part 3 could go off the rails, and Zack could be the main character, and we're just completely off base. I don't think we are, and hey, that's the joy of it. It's all speculation. But at the end of the day, guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Under the Plate. We greatly appreciate your support and are especially excited for some of the stuff we're preparing in the next coming weeks. with that being said, stay tuned, leave a like, leave a comment, let us know what you thought and your perception of the game, and we'll catch you next time.